Tonight, I want to talk particularly about the pressures experienced by kids of different ages, especially in affluent communities, to become conventionally successful. The ways in which kids are being prepared from their earliest days to go to Harvard, a process I've come to call Preparation H. I would say Stanford or Berkeley, but it doesn't have quite the same dose of hemorrhoidal humor that I think we're all looking for in the evening. But there are kids who, even in elementary and middle school, are being groomed, are having a resume prepared for them that reads, as Nancy Sizer says, like an obituary of their childhoods, so that when they get to high school, they have been trained not to think of high school as intrinsically valuable in terms of what they will learn, but merely as preparation for what comes next. In fact, there are private schools and high schools that call themselves prep schools. The prefix prep indicating that what they're doing now has no intrinsic value. How to call themselves that is a remarkable confession that we've given up on the value of what they're doing now. Our job is to groom you, is to encourage you to just focus on something that by the time kids are 15 in certain neighborhoods, they don't even need encouragement to do, because they are signing up for clubs and extracurriculars purely on the basis of whether they are likely to impress college admissions committees, not because of any value they find in the activity itself. They're signing up for particular classes thinking only in terms of whether it gives them an extra point on their GPA. They are making all their decisions about their lives in terms of whether it's going to help. They are willing to sacrifice sleep, physical health, friends, pleasure reading, and all kinds of other activities purely on the basis of adding another few points to the midterm or another few points on the SAT. All the decisions are made with this in mind. Everything is about reaching for what comes next. And when they finally get into the college of their parents, of their choice, it's not even over. Some of these kids have felt so pressured that there's nothing left inside. Some of these kids have redesigned themselves purely for the purpose of pleasing and impressing their parents and teachers and admissions committees, and they don't even know who they are at this point. And I don't have to tell you that in neighborhoods like this, in areas like this one, some kids have paid the ultimate price for this preoccupation with conventional success, with the ultimate tragedy of children taking their own lives. And for every astonishing tragedy like that makes us weep, there are how many other kids who are not quite there yet, but are cutting themselves, or starving themselves, or drugging themselves. Kids who are desperately unhappy, and who don't even know who they are or what they want anymore, because their well-meaning parents have imposed upon them an agenda of conventional success. The great psychoanalyst Erich Fromm said, "Few parents have the courage to care more about their children's happiness than about their children's success." And they are paying the price for parents preoccupied with that conventional success. One of the interesting things I'm going to point out in a few minutes is that even though many of us are aware of the emotional, the social, and psychological costs that kids often pay for that kind of academic pressure to achieve, there are also intellectual costs to that pressure that often go unnoticed, and I'll say more about that. But do you know what happens when a great majority of those kids do not get into the most selective couple dozen expensive colleges in the country, in which case they sacrifice their happiness in childhoods apparently for nothing. But even those who are the success stories, don't stop. It's not as if their life can now begin and they can begin to derive social and intellectual value from what they do, because as soon as they get to the college that they were finally able to do and everything paid off, these kids have now found for themselves a furrow. They can't think their way out of this, so they're thinking about the same thing again. Which classes should I take that are gut classes to get me the highest possible grade for the least possible effort? Which extracurricular should I sign up now? Because I just have to groom the resume all over again in order to get into the most selective law school or medical school or engineering school or graduate school. That's the whole point. And again, they're reaching forward, and there's nothing about their present lives from which they derive satisfaction, let alone a commitment to social justice. And when they finally get in there, it doesn't stop, because now they have to figure out a way to get into the best medical residency program, or the best entry-level corporate position, or tenure-track job at a university, or the best law firm that they can, so that they can reach and pull their way up that hierarchy, pushing ahead, pulling to the next brass ring, hoping to succeed and do better than everybody else around them. And it never stops until maybe one night they wake up in the middle of the night in a tastefully appointed bedroom, and they ask, what happened to my life? Our job, our challenge as parents and teachers is not to propel them along farther and faster on that treadmill. Our job is not to help them figure out how they can squeeze out a few extra points on the midterm. Our job is to figure out how we can prevent that tragedy of successful people from happening. Successful in quotes. Successful in the conventional sense. We shouldn't need a horrible tragedy of a kid who gives up to convince us of the quiet desperation that surrounds so many kids and starts so early. In the journal Child Development some years ago, a researcher did a study of middle school students in a community not unlike Palo Alto and other communities around here. And in an article published called Privileged but Pressured, a study of affluent youth, she found disturbingly high rates of drinking, especially among boys, and depression, especially among girls, among suburban 11 and 12-year-olds. Tracing this back to the fact that these kids were already being led to focus on getting into top-ranked colleges at that age, before they were even teenagers. Furthermore, the 7th graders who reported that their parents placed a lot of emphasis on academic achievement, always justifying it as giving them more options and being in their interest, the kids' interest, those kids were likely to show signs of distress and, quote, maladaptive perfectionism. Those problems were far less prevalent among their classmates, whose parents were more concerned about their children's well-being than about their achievement. Notice that those two goals are not just different theoretically, but in practice tend to pull in opposite directions. A remarkable study that is borne out in such communities on a regular basis. By the way, one of the authors of the study had already discovered that relatively wealthy teenagers have higher rates of not only anxiety, but substance abuse than their counterparts in the inner city. Now, what interests me in doing something about this situation is the need to look simultaneously at home and at school, but I would put it a little differently, to look at attitudes, but also at systems or structures. And I'm going to try to build a case that it's not sufficient to do just one of those. When I talk about attitudes, especially on the part of parents, There are many things to focus on, including a phenomenon that social psychologists in a very different context have called BIRG, B-I-R-G, which stands for basking in reflected glory. Here we're talking about the parents who managed to let you know within 30 seconds of meeting them about all the amazing accomplishments of their child, who was reading at 4, who made all-state tennis, who got into Berkeley early decision. I used to parody this posture when I were talking about my own child. I would say, you know, I'm a little concerned. She's 2 years old, and her lips still move when she reads. But I've decided to stop just making fun of this tendency and to treat it very seriously because of how much damage it does. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with being proud of our children. But when bragging is too intense, or too frequent, or starts up too soon, you begin to get the sense that something is wrong, that the parent's identity may be a little too closely wrapped up in the child's accomplishments, especially when the boasts sound more competitive than loving. You know, that ring of how it's not just smart, but smarter than every other kid, as in those bumper stickers, my child, unlike yours, is the implication. The wonderful late comedian George Carlin poked at that wonderfully. He talked about getting a bumper sticker that said, "We are the proud parents of a child whose self-esteem is sufficient that he doesn't need us promoting his minor scholastic accomplishments on the back of our car." When you listen to these Berg parents, these boastful parents, you start to get the sense that in many cases, the accomplishments they're talking about on the parts of their children didn't exactly happen on their own, but were sort of squeezed out of them by a parent who was hovering a little too close, pushing a little too hard, and maybe loving in a way that is problematic. You can't help wondering whether those children would still be loved if the kids stopped being so damned impressive. And that's what leads me to the next point with respect to parental attitudes. It is not enough to love our children. We have to love them unconditionally, which is to say for who they are, not for what they do. Or as my friend Debbie Meyer likes to say, we have to love them for no damn good reason. That is an important distinction and a very difficult posture to strike in a society where most advice we get in parenting is to be a conditional parent, to take things that kids like and use them as rewards, withholding them and offering them strategically in order to manipulate their behavior. And it's not just dessert I'm talking about, or money. It's affection and approval and care. Care that has to be earned isn't worthy of being called care. And yet, that's precisely what we do. That's what praise is about. Praise, saying good job, takes our excitement and approval and attention and says you have to jump through these hoops to get it. The alternative to praise isn't criticism or chilly silence. The alternative to praise is love that's continuous, where they never feel, I have to do a good job. There are strings attached to my parents' excitement about me, where I have to do well in school or in sports, or I have to be well-behaved, which our society values apparently more than any of the adjectives you came up with, which means not a pain in the ass to me. Our highest encomium to a good child is somebody who's easy to care for, not a nuisance in public. Whatever the conditions, kids start to internalize what Carl Rogers half a century ago called conditions of worth. I'm only valuable if I'm funny or thin or smart or did something my parents can brag to their friends about. But it doesn't matter what the condition is. It matters that there are conditions at all. And a fascinating series of research, series of studies conducted by American, Israeli, and Belgian researchers over the last 10 years has found that at different age levels, whenever kids think that their parents' approval is conditional, and far more kids think that than the parents think that's what they're doing. What matters is not what the parent thinks. What predicts to the outcome is how the child experiences it, full stop. And when kids feel that their parents get a lot more excited when they come home with a trophy or a great report card, it can sometimes work to get more trophies and report cards in the short run, but it also leads to resentment of and alienation from the parents when the kids get to be young adults. They want less to do with those parents who they know were manipulating them. And what happens too is that kids who feel that they were conditionally parented feel as if they're being controlled by remote control, that they are unable to take real pleasure and pride in their own accomplishments. You know, a lot of psychological research has distinguished between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Have you heard these terms? Intrinsic motivation is a fancy term that means you do something because you find it gratifying in its own right. You read a book because you want to go on an adventure, or you want to learn stuff, or you like the way this author writes. You help somebody by sharing your dessert because she really likes these kind of brownies. Extrinsic motivation means you do something to get a reward, a sticker, a gold star, a pizza or an ice cream, $1, or a patronizing pat on the head. Good job. Those two kinds of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic, are not only different, and not only differently valuable, which is to say that intrinsic is more powerful than extrinsic, they tend to pull in opposite directions. I will now summarize more than 80 studies in a sentence, a feat rarely attempted in a Jewish community center. The more you reward people for doing something, the more they tend to lose interest in whatever they had to do to get the reward. So if I say, good job, I really like the way you shared your sandwich with Diane. You're such a good sharer. Good job, good job, good job, good job, good job. It's like parental Tourette's syndrome. But if I say something like that to her, the research shows she's likely to be a little more selfish as a result of that interaction, because she's learned that the reason to help Diane is not how it makes Diane feel, but she's going to get something out of it. She's been taught that the purpose of helping is self-interest. And so if there's nobody around to congratulate her or give her a prize, she's less likely to help than she was before she was praised. The extrinsic motivator of the verbal reward reduced the intrinsic commitment to help. Exactly the same thing is true of reading. If you wanted to destroy children's interest in books, give them a prize for reading a book. Give them a pizza. Give them an A. Because now they've learned that books are a tedious prerequisite to getting the good thing. Tell your kid, all right, honey, if you do all the homework math problems, including the extra credit problem, you can spend an extra half hour on Facebook. What did you just teach? 2 words. Math sucks. Kid learns, if they have to reward me to do this, it must be something I wouldn't want to do. Never mind the control aspect for this. But here's where a lot of people get confused. They understand that extrinsic motivation, rewards, are not only ineffective but dangerous, but they think the alternative is internal motivation, and it's not. There's a world of difference between intrinsic and internal. And those driven high school students prove it to us every day. By the time they're 16, these kind of kids in affluent communities don't need parents standing in front of them with a carrot or behind them with a stick. They don't need extrinsic inducements anymore because they've swallowed them whole. They're controlling them from inside. Parents sometimes do that kind of humble bragging about their kids. I have to tell my daughter, honey, come on, it's midnight. Enough with the work already. Go to sleep. I'm not recognizing this child is in acute distress. They're proud of how successful their kid is because she's internally motivated and getting no sleep. Internally, yes. Intrinsically, doubtful. We're talking about internally motivated kids who are workaholics in training. Many of them are joyless. Many of them are in real trouble. But because they get good grades and good test scores, the parents are pleased instead of looking for help. Internal is not sufficient. Internalizing self-discipline is often toxic. Grit often leads kids not to give up when they should let go. In addition to the fatuous fad of grit taking over our schools, calling our attention away from whether the kids have been given something to do worth doing. The people focusing on grit and self-regulation are not fixing the schools to make them better. They're fixing the kids to make them conform to whatever they're told to do. Cui bono, as the Latins say. Who benefits from focusing on self-regulation and grit and fixing the kid? The people who now don't have to make the schools worth going to because the problem has been individualized the way our culture loves to do. All of this gets back for parents, though, to the idea of making sure that kids understand that we love them no matter what. Because kids don't need to have love turned into a commodity, a trophy, something they have to earn, as if it were an economic transaction. I got a letter years ago from a woman in a rural town in California. I mean, literally that, a letter. It's the weirdest thing. My computer was turned off, and a guy came to the door and gave it to me. This is the next big thing, trust me. Brief excerpts. Dear Mr. Kohn, thank you for writing Unconditional Parenting. I am the product of exactly the kind of conditional parenting you describe. I was always an excellent student, earning the highest grades and unending adulation from my teachers. In the last few years, I've been president of my neighborhood association, a community volunteer, and a regular blood donor. In my spare time, well, you guessed it, I have no spare time. I'm also severely depressed, suffer from anxiety, and see a psychotherapist weekly. I've only recently learned to read for pleasure. Before that, I had some recreational hobbies, gardening, keeping house, baking, but all of these resulted in some sort of material manifestation of my efforts. A perfectly weed-free garden, an immaculate home, a beautiful cake. But the obsession with perfection and with how others would judge my efforts was always there. Thus, my hobbies were hopelessly unfulfilling. For example, when we were first married, I would show up to family gatherings at my in-laws' house clutching some unbelievably extravagant dish or dessert I'd made, and I'd get a few polite compliments, but mostly I think they all wondered why on earth I would spend so much time doing something so silly. I, on the other hand, would feel crushed that they weren't more impressed. Where does this drive come from? Why have I projected it onto my husband and the other people in my adult life? My parents are, and always were, extremely achievement-oriented. And their parenting style is very much what you call the doing-to kind. There wasn't much working with. Feelings and emotional needs were not valued or seldom even acknowledged. My parents are not bad people. I believe they truly didn't know any better, and I know they'd say they love me very much and that it was out of love that they pushed me to do well for my own sake. But their push, their subtle message that I am not okay to them as I am, coupled with their denial of my emotional needs, made a profound impact on my fundamental beliefs about my self-worth and lovability, and feelings of grief, despair, and dread are what I'm left with. I don't have children, so why did I pick up your book? Because now I have to learn to reparent myself.